everyone, welcome to Broken Slippers. I'm your host Lily Holman. This is the channel where we examine the less successful Disney films of the past 25 years to figure out how they contribute to the studio's education and ultimately lead to the more successful Disney films of the past 25 years. So, let's get started. While it's tempting to believe, especially if you are a millennial, that all Disney from the mid-90s was genius work with no flaws and just a whole lot of magic, looking closely at the movies proves that much like Pocahontas' chosen path along the river, the path was not steady, smooth, or simple, especially after Lion King. So, Pocahontas proved just the first of a few different films which are remembered better than they were actually received at the time. Disney didn't reach Lion King levels of financial success again until Frozen, and that both are kind of exceptions if you look at the numbers, but they didn't even reach Aladdin levels of financial success again until Tangled. So that leads to technically a 17-year-long dip in the numbers. So where did all the pixie dust go? Well, after Pocahontas, it went to Paris. In 1996, Disney released Hunchback of Notre Dame, directed by Gary Truesdale and Kirk Wise of Beauty and the Beast fame. It's hanging out on my list because while it did cross the 100 million threshold with 325 million, it has a 73% on Rotten Tomatoes and therefore is lower than that B I stipulated in our second episode. It is definitely not worth ignoring, however, and in my opinion makes for a more interesting case study than Pocahontas just a year before. So, with that in mind, let's start with the good things. You can see the Truesdale-Wise touch in the sheer beauty of the film. The Bells of Notre Dame is stunning and elevated by the animation, as are any scenes that take place in the cathedral itself. You also get a very lively village feel to the crowds in Paris, much like you do in Beauty and the Beast, and this is especially evident in the truly spectacular Feast of Fools scene. So once again, the pair seem to respond well to the Broadway style of Mencken. In this case, they bring back Stephen Schwartz from Pocahontas. So it still doesn't have the playful feel to it that Howard Ashman brought to Beast, but it does feel pretty epic, almost like Disney does Les Mis. Meanwhile, unlike Pocahontas, Disney did remember to hire comedians to attempt to lighten the mood in this one. There are 3 gargoyles voiced by Charles Kimbrough, Mary Wickles, and most notably Jason Alexander. They end up functioning a lot like Timon and Pumbaa in Lion King as opposed to characters like Lumiere and Cogsworth, in the way that they function as allies and emotional support to Quasimodo, but they don't really have much of a plot function except as comic relief. They have their work cut out for them, however, because they have to lighten up a story that ends up being about bullying, racism, religion, and sexual repression. So similarly to Pocahontas, that negativity does end up being one of the fatal flaws of the film, but they go to more interesting places before admitting defeat. So while Disney did plenty of work telling the stories of outcasts before this one, Hunchback kind of takes that theme and puts it on steroids. It centers on Quasimodo, who is a man born to gypsies, but he's born with a hunchback, and his mother gets hunted down by the evil Frollo, but escapes to the church where they are given sanctuary. His mother ends up dying, and he is put in the custody of Frollo to punish Frollo, but Frollo takes that responsibility and ends up gaslighting him so that Quasimodo doesn't come out into society. Even when Quasimodo does come out into society, he is mocked for his appearance and rejected as a monster. So this isn't new to Disney, as I said. We see the beginnings of this type of attitude in Beauty and the Beast, where you get a particularly cruel village that doesn't accept Belle for who she is, but we end up leaving that world for most of the movie to a castle full of characters who do love Belle and do have the best intentions. In Hunchback, unfortunately, we don't ever leave that cruel city. At one point in this movie, we go to the place called the Court of Miracles, which is the potential of being a community of outcasts that might accept Quasimodo. We don't end up spending enough time there to get to know the Court of Miracles, and most of their introduction is actually malicious since they think that Quasimodo and his ally Phoebus are spies. So basically we end up getting set up for the potential of a world of outcasts that they never follow through on, and the resulting sum is the opposite of a world of something like Rescuers, where there's an underlying structure ready to help you in case you need it. Instead, the world is poised to turn on you at any moment, and the film doesn't really do much to counter that initial belief. Intriguingly, however, the end result is also a world that thrives on individual goodness as opposed to universal goodness. What they lose in the comfort taken from things like the Rescue Aid Society, they gain in more three-dimensional heroes like Quasimodo and Esmeralda and Phoebus. So Quasimodo is a pretty typical hero with lots of wonderful internal goodness and bravery and such, so we're not going to actually spend too much time on him, but his supporting humans are a bit more notable. So Esmeralda is awesome in the sense that she fights for justice and is confident and competent enough to navigate on her own. She also owns her sexuality, which we will get to in a minute, and the end result is that she ends up contributing to a tradition of stronger and stronger heroines that will eventually lead to Mulan and later on Moana. So yay Esmeralda. But the more unique character is Phoebus, and he is as if they took John Smith, gave him a sense of humor, and also gave him a conscience. So he is in a similar position as John Smith at the beginning, where he is a soldier who is being asked to commit truly atrocious acts to people who are different than he is, but he knows to question it without having to fall in love with one of those people. Obviously, he ends up falling in love with Esmeralda, but he doesn't have to do so in order to act on his conscience. He's also voiced by Kevin Kline, so he has a sense of humor. So the end result of both of these characters being part of this community is that while they take away the comforting pillow of having mice or toys or a whole city ready to back you up, they elevate their story with better individuals under much more severe stakes, and I think that's one of the factors that gave Hunchback a 76 as opposed to Pocahontas's 56 on Rotten Tomatoes. So, why doesn't it have an A? Well, I personally like the warm and fuzzy Disney films better. We can't just blame this on cynicism and anger. Instead, the flaws lie with the villain, and weirdly enough, also the church the film takes its name from. While we will get to Frollo in a minute, and he is obviously worse, this is the first and only outwardly religious film that Disney has ever made. They have had positive priests as characters before, but this film actually has songs like God Help the Outcasts and uses the church as a place of sanctuary. The former is a beautiful song, and the latter is a very useful plot device, but it is a flaw in the sense that it is a bit exclusionary. Disney, especially modern-day Disney, takes pride on staying neutral with politics and religion. Their businesses are built to take audiences from all over the world and all over the country from many different backgrounds, and because of that, they cannot afford to pigeonhole themselves, and this is one of the few times they risk doing so. The end result means that there is a bit of a barrier if you are not religious, in the sense that the characters kind of act on their belief in God and are rewarded for it. This is not much of a problem, but it's just a small distancing device, but the main problem is Frollo the villain. So Frollo is a terrifying villain, not because of the way he is animated or any significant use of lime green smoke like the other villains, but instead because his villainy is behavior women actually have to fear in their day-to-day lives. In a strange way, he is actually one of the most modern Disney villains that Disney has. So he starts out the film motivated by the racism that drove Ratcliffe and Pocahontas, but he then compounds it with sexism when he gets even more driven by his confusion over his attraction to Esmeralda. His big number, Hellfire, blames his attraction entirely on her after her sexy dance at the Feast of Fools, and translates that confusion and hate for her being a gypsy into violence and possessiveness. He basically becomes that Twitter troll that is upset that he doesn't have a girlfriend, so he attacks other women for their sexuality. Is this an incredibly relevant issue? Yes. Does that mean it should be tackled in a Disney film? Perhaps not. As I have said many, many times before, it's not that Disney shouldn't take on these more adult and more complicated issues. It's that when they do, they have to be fully prepared for it. They have to be ready to deliver with something like Zootopia, as opposed to this adaptation of a Hugo novel, which doesn't quite work. More importantly is also that the solutions the film posits to this problem are not simply that Esmeralda should be left alone, which would be the kind of rational response that we should let her live her life, but they end up suggesting that she should be paired with the right man, and that's going to be the solution to her problems. It makes the mission of the film quite confusing because that man is not our hero, Quasimodo, but Phoebus. Again, this shouldn't be a problem because obviously if we can't leave Esmeralda alone, at least we should respect her choice. But earlier in the film, Jason Alexander's gargoyle suggests to Quasimodo and to us that he is a catch and the world has yet to figure it out. It roots his acceptance in romantic love, and therefore since we want Quasimodo to be happy and accepted, we also kind of want him to end up with Esmeralda, or at least in a pairing, and we are never given a replacement for Esmeralda. Because of that, it makes her choice seem shallow and predictable, and it also makes it so that the movie, which makes a villain out of a man making Esmeralda a sexual object, is actually about 3 different men fighting over her. The film sets us up with all these confusing romantic factions, and by doing so digs a hole it has trouble getting out of, and also subscribes to some of the harmful behavior that is driving the villain. Also, if you are a kid during all of this, I can't help but imagine that you would be very confused because it is dealing with issues you really should not be dealing with yet. Once again, I am not advocating for Disney not to tackle more serious and more adult issues, but while doing so, you have to be super prepared to help your audience of all ages navigate these waters and get something worthwhile out of it. In the end, Hunchback fails because it feels more confusing than anything else, and that confusion can end up drowning out its many strengths. So that's Hunchback. It's a really interesting movie. It's very strong in many fields, but its Achilles heel ends up being its ambition when it comes to different themes. It's also another issue of Disney being unprepared to take on more adult material. Now, what I actually found most intriguing about Hunchback is what came immediately after that. As we mentioned, Hunchback came too quickly after Pocahontas for them to realize that they were getting into a bit of a serious rut, but after Hunchback, you start to see Disney react against itself and strive for humor. Most intriguingly, that humor will attempt to be meta humor with a not insignificant amount of self-awareness. It's not 100% successful off the bat, and the progression may not be as apparent unless you are like me and watching these in order, but I still think it is interesting and worth talking about, so we're going to get into that next time. Until then, I hope you have a lovely and magical day, week, hour, minute, lifetime, whatever amount of time progresses between when we see each other next, and meanwhile, I'm headed to the Feast of Fools. Have a lovely day.